Me today. It's great to be able to talk to you all. So as Emma says, I'm going to be talking to you today about trying to balance aquaculture development with wild salmon conservation in Scotland. So is that going to click on? Oh, there we go. I'm going to skip over this because Emma's just gone into that, so that's all good. So I'm going to talk you through who Fisheries Management Scotland are, just in case you haven't heard of us. We're the representative body for district salmon fishery boards and fisheries trusts, which I'll go into a bit more detail about in a moment. There's just 4 staff members within the organisation, so we're quite a small team in terms of the work that we do and the area that we cover. And our main role is to promote and ensure the best fisheries management for the protection, preservation and development of Scotland's wild salmon and freshwater fish, along with their fisheries environment. And the fishery boards and the fisheries trusts, they do a lot of really good work all across Scotland. And our job is to represent the interests of those member organisations at a wider forum. So take things forward to the Scottish Government, for example, or other regulators within the system. So district salmon fishery boards and the River Tweed Commission, which because of its the way that it kind of crosses between England and Scotland is set up slightly different, they all have power and duties set out in law, so they have legal responsibilities. They have the power to raise a salmon levy for the purpose of funding management. So that means that they can charge proprietors who are renting out areas of the river for fishing a fee which supports them in their work towards managing salmon and sea trout. They also have powers to appoint fisheries enforcement officers, otherwise known as water bailiffs. And these guys are in charge of making sure there's no illegal fishing going on or other wildlife crimes, such as those against freshwater pearl mussels. Their remit is limited to only salmon and sea trout, so they do not focus on other species within the freshwater environment or the kind of ecosystem as a whole. In contrast, river and fisheries trusts are responsible for the research and monitoring across Scotland within our river network. So their main role when they're working alongside a fishery board is to provide the kind of scientific evidence to the board, and they will go on to make those management decisions. They're also involved in a lot of river restoration work, so that could be removing dams that would be impassable to salmon or sea trout, planting trees, anything that involves kind of improving that habitat for freshwater fish. They also do a lot of work with education initiatives, so that is all about engaging children with what's going on in their local area, how they can help, what do they need to be aware of. And they have an all species remit, so they are focused on other freshwater fish such as eels. They take into consideration otters, the whole ecosystem, and they kind of cover a broader remit. So before I go into kind of the specifics of my role, I would like to ask you a question. So for those of you who have an iPhone, if you just open your camera and scan that QR code, or if you have a QR scanner app and scan that QR code for me, it should take you to a site called Mentimeter. And if you don't have a QR scanner, just pop that URL into your browser. And that will ask a question. So do you think salmon farming is a good thing for feeding our growing population? So the world's population, basically. So let's have a look and see what kind of split we have. Okay, creeping up. Okay, I'll give everyone a few more minutes. I'm conscious we've got quite a few people in the audience, so I want to give everyone the time to kind of get their results in. It's interesting. No got off to a strong start, but it's falling behind now. Okay. I'll pause it there, but I think that gives us quite an interesting split. So we've got sort of 9 people that feel that yes, it is a good thing, and 4 people that think no, it's not. So I just want to keep that in your mind as we kind of move forward, and I'm just going to sort of unpick that a little bit and look further into what salmon farming actually means for Scotland in terms of its economy. Oh, sorry, right. So we now have 7.8 billion people in the world, and that is a lot of people to feed. And with sort of 2/3 of fish stocks now being at their maximum sustainable yield or above, that means that we've had to look to alternative ways in which to incorporate seafood into our diet. And aquaculture now, according to the FAO, represents 46% of all of the seafood that we eat. So whilst, as you can see with the orange and red, the kind of level of fisheries input has leveled out, aquaculture continues to be on that kind of upward trend. But what's the situation in Scotland? So this map just gives you a kind of rough idea of the aquaculture sites across Scotland. So as you can see, it's kind of mainly focused along the west coast and then Orkney and Shetland. And when you look at the production levels for Scottish aquaculture, they've been gradually increasing. And last year, we had sort of a 30% increase from the previous year, and we're now up to sort of, well, predicted to be around the 207,000 mark for salmon farming production in Scotland. So it's a real growing area, and it's going to continue to do so. So whilst farmed salmon is now usually the common alternative to wild fish, it's very unusual that you will go into a supermarket and you will find salmon that is wild. Often it might be Pacific if it is. There are some kind of wild capture fisheries in British Columbia. The majority of salmon that you buy will probably be farmed if it is an Atlantic species. However, the point that I want to get across here is that when we consider the salmon exports, this is taken from the Scottish Salmon Producers Organisation, Scottish salmon isn't, it's a high value product. It goes to mainly kind of quite wealthy and first world countries, and it's produced in mass amounts and represents a huge amount of money and value. It's, when you think about salmon, it's kind of associated with maybe slightly posher dinners. It's certainly not always the case. You know, it might be what you have as your starter or a special breakfast on Christmas Day, something like that. But it's often a product that is more associated with the higher end of the food that we eat. And therefore, when we think about salmon farming, it's important to kind of pick that apart from aquaculture as a whole, which does contribute to feeding the kind of world's kind of needs. But salmon farming may have a slightly different area between that. So why is salmon farming important for Scotland? Well, it's UK's largest food export, so that's a massive kind of thing to have. And it supports almost 12,000 jobs in the Scottish economy. It's got an £885 million gross value added and a turnover of 1.5 billion. So it's pretty huge when it comes to Scotland's economy and the kind of money and jobs and value that it brings. And that is completely recognised. And what about the wild salmon fisheries? So with every kind of fishing area that will be open for salmon and fisheries, you know, you will get hotels and restaurants taking bookings as a result of that. But it's on a much smaller scale to salmon fishing, to salmon farming. So it's sort of around 4,000 full-time equivalent jobs and almost £80 million gross value added. And it's expected that in a year, anglers will spend about £135 million in terms of angling. I should also highlight that whilst the figures for the salmon farming sort of economy values, they're very recent, sort of 2019, and these figures actually haven't been updated since 2014. So there's a little bit of a difference, so that this could have changed in that time, obviously. And how are wild salmon doing? That comes into this as well. So I think the general picture is not well. It's recognised that Scotland's salmon are at crisis point. So in 2019, we had the 4th lowest record of catches since 1952, and in 2018, the 2nd lowest on record since 1952. And the graph on the right-hand side there just gives you a clear picture of fish, not just in Scotland, but all across the North Atlantic, and the kind of declines that we've seen over time. So there really needs to be kind of a recognition that salmon are in trouble, and that's for a number of reasons. Climate change is a massive factor, the freshwater environment, and fish being able to get to their spawning habitats. All of these things contribute to the decline of salmon across Scotland. But what about aquaculture? Where does that come into the kind of level of pressures? So as I say, it's definitely not the only reason why salmon farming has declined, and it's part of a much bigger picture. But there are things that we need to consider when we're thinking about the interactions between salmon in the wild and salmon in the farm. So the interactions are kind of hazards. They're risks that could be there. The first one I'm going to talk about is sea lice, which is mainly an issue for the marine environment. So sea lice actually can't tolerate fresh water. So whenever the fish, the wild fish hits fresh water, the lice die, they drop off and it no longer becomes a problem. The issue mainly with lice is that they can damage smolts, which are the young, kind of much smaller fish that are leaving the rivers and heading into the marine environment. Sea lice are a naturally occurring parasite. They exist in all marine environments, and salmon will have them quite naturally. But when you have a salmon farm, the higher densities of fish within those cages have the potential to be the perfect conditions for which sea lice can breed very quickly. And sometimes when you get high levels within the pens, that can then kind of transfer onto the wild populations as they pass by. And at certain levels, that will become a lethal level and a problem. Escapes can also be an issue. They can occur both in marine environments and in freshwater. So in freshwater environments, we're breeding very small fish up to the stage of where they're ready to go to the marine environment. And then obviously in the marine environment, the fish are much bigger and are there for a number of years. They can be quite sort of small and relatively insignificant escapes. You know, one or two fish, you know, are dropped over the side when someone's counting, or a seal can damage a net and one or two escape. And then they can be fairly significant. So, for example, this picture is of a farm off near Arran, and unfortunately, as a result of some a mooring line failure and then caused by Storm Ellen, the whole farm kind of shifted, and 48,834 fish all escaped into the Firth of Clyde. And we were able to track where these fish went using anglers' records, but we now need to understand what that actually means. So we've set up a genetic monitoring project in order to see whether those fish have been able to breed with the wild populations and what kind of potential risks that can be. Of course, if there's no risk to wild salmon from this sort of event, then that's fantastic news, but we just need to have the evidence to make sure. We're also not quite clear on disease transfer between wild fish and farm fish. So we just, again, that's something that there needs to be more information on, and whether there's an outbreak within a farm, could that cause any kind of problems for the wild fish? We're very much of the mind that if there is the right development using the right technology in the right location, then fish farming should absolutely go ahead. Fisheries Management Scotland are not an anti-fish farming organisation, but it's just about having the right measures in place to ensure that it can continue to grow and provide the benefits for the economy without being at the expense of wild salmon in Scotland. So let's talk about the regulation in Scotland at the moment. So as it stands, the regulation is pretty lacking when it comes to Scottish salmon. They tend to fall between the gaps. It's had recent scrutiny in Scottish Parliament from 2 committee inquiries, and they both concluded that the status quo is not an option. The regulatory framework is spread across several regulatory bodies, and that means it's confusing and poorly coordinated. So each one will have its slightly different remit, and it means that people tend to kind of feel like the other one is handling it, or someone else is dealing with it, and then nothing tends to happen. So the local authorities, so these are the planners, the local councillors, they're responsible for giving planning permission. So just as if you were going to extend your house, you would need planning permission. To put a fish farm in, you would also need planning permission. These local authorities then go out to a public consultation where all stakeholders can review all of the information that the fish farm has provided and either support that farm or object to it. And then they make a decision based on all of those responses and the consideration from the statutory consultees, which will be people such as Marine Scotland or Nature Scot. The Scottish Environment Protection Agency, on the other hand, they deal with the actual biomass consent. So they look at how many fish should be allowed within the pens. So you've got the local authorities dealing with the infrastructure, but you've got the SEPA involved dealing with the actual numbers of fish. Now, SEPA don't actually consider wild fish interactions at all. Their license for biomass is based purely on things like chemical release and the impacts on the benthic habitat. So we've already got a bit of a disconnect there. The Marine Scotland Fish Health Inspectorate, they're responsible for the health and welfare of salmon, but only within the cages. So they don't consider the health and welfare of the wild fish that may interact with those farm fish. And then Nature Scots are a statutory consultee involved in the process, but their main focus is on special areas of conservation. So areas that have been designated specifically for a purpose. So in the cases of salmon farming, it would be SAC rivers designated because of Atlantic salmon being a special feature for that river. So between the four of them, it forms a kind of system that just doesn't quite work, and it was widely agreed that something needed to change. So before I move on to the next thing and kind of considering all that I've said there, I want you to just have another look at Mincemeter. So if you can all scan that barcode or use the URL to go to the link. And I'll flip back to this. So have a think here. So in terms of, I've just talked about there that there's a whole load of things going on. We've got, you know, that Scottish salmon farming is really important for jobs, but then we've also got that there are wild fish considerations. So just where do you sit in terms of ranking these kind of 5 things, which are just a selection of the kind of things that are being balanced up constantly by people working on regulating salmon farming?
Somebody asked to go back to the link, if that's possible.
Sure, yeah. So you can also just go to, oh, sorry, it hides when I go at the top, but yeah, there you go. Okay. So if anyone missed it at the top there, it says you can go to menti.com and just use the code. So if anyone kind of missed the URL, then that's another way to get that. Getting some interesting results. We had sort of 11 people last time, so I'll just give everyone another minute. Okay, so that's really interesting. So the kind of clear winner there is that Scottish salmon farming provides important jobs, and I think that's absolutely right. It's such a massive part of our economy. Oh, we've got some last minute changes. And then in second place, we've got the wild fish could face harmful levels of sea lice when treatments are resisted. And just below that, although that's been kind of hovering around the top, that we need to consider that by using treatments to get rid of sea lice, then the farm fish may get stressed out and that can cause them harm as well. And then down in fourth, we've got that the Scottish salmon industry is the UK's biggest export. And then at the bottom there, we've got wild fish produces important jobs and supports tourism. And that's completely kind of understandable. It's a smaller sector than what Scottish farming is in terms of the economy that it provides. Okay. So what do we need to do so that we can allow Scottish farming to continue to develop and grow and be that essential part of our economy and offer all of those jobs without it letting it be at the expense of the wild salmon in Scotland? So as I mentioned, this has been under recent scrutiny in Scottish government, and it was decided to kind of launch a big focus group to try and come out with a system that could be accepted by both stakeholders, so across the wild fisheries network, and also amongst regulators and within the industry. So the Salmon Interactions Working Group set out to do exactly that, and last April that group published their report. This contained 44 recommendations to the Scottish Government that would create a regulatory system for salmon farming that would mean that we could make sure that there weren't any impact or a minimal impact on wild salmon. There was unanimous agreement from all participants, which is really important, that the current regulatory system is not fit for purpose and that this was the way forward. So the next step, and a key part of my role, is to enforce this into legislation so that we all have a system and a framework by which we can work with. So for example, at the moment, it's not a sort of an offence, a legal offence to have an escape. It would be if you didn't notify the relevant bodies that you'd had an escape, but to actually have an escape, you don't actually have any kind of repercussions as a result of that. one of the recommendations from this working group is that there would be some kind of fee associated, which would then be fed back into the wild fishery sector to be able to support habitat restoration or improving the kind of freshwater environment. There would also be clear license conditions, which meant that if a salmon farming operation wasn't kind of achieving specific sea lice levels or wasn't working well enough in terms of controlling escapes, that there would be license conditions that meant that the farm could reduce its biomass or be removed altogether. So it basically just gives us a better framework in which to manage the situation and ensure that everyone is working off the same page. We would really like to see adaptive management for sea lice and escapes. So we're currently working with the boards and trusts while we wait for this new regulatory framework to make sure that when there are issues with sea lice or with an escape, that companies are then looking into the kind of root cause, if you like, and then working to improve and learn from that. There's a long-running system of monitoring wild salmon fish in Scotland, and we've kind of used that in a variety of ways, and that can also be really useful data in terms of managing the situation and understanding where there are impacts and where things aren't impacting the wild fish. This can all be fed into something called environmental management plans. So these are basically agreements between the local fishery board and a salmon farming company to make sure that that wild fish are being kind of monitored and that there is a process for that adaptive management to kind of create a positive feedback loop in which the farming operators improve how they're operating and reduce that pressure on wild salmon stocks. At the moment, this isn't kind of a necessary thing. The salmon farming companies are all being fantastic in terms of their engagement and the work that they're doing, but it's not a condition. And what we would like to see is it move into being a condition of planning consent so that it is kind of an enforceable legal document. We're working to develop techniques to sample wild fish and assess those impacts at a local level. So this is involving the industry. We're currently kind of trying to develop ways in which we can really tell where the impacts are coming from and how do we kind of create a canary in a coal mine type situation to understand where problems might be arising. And that absolutely relies on the knowledge from salmon farmers who are kind of working with their fish and also doing things like modelling where sea lice may end up in the marine environment to make sure that we're monitoring in the right places to be able to capture the right information. So monitoring of wild fish with an appropriate and precautionary feedback to farm management should become a statutory responsibility on all farms, and that's what we're working towards. So as I mentioned, we're doing a lot of work with the industry and across stakeholder communities, and that's really key to understanding the best way forward. We want to have an open dialogue. We want the salmon farming companies to be able to come to us with any issues, and we want to be able to go to them to better understand their operations. I'm not a salmon farming expert, and I rely on them to be able to tell me what's reasonable, what's practical, what's going to work to make sure that we're kind of working together to move forward. And it's also really important that there's a knowledge exchange, you know, things that they can do in terms of the sort of work in sea lice counting and monitoring is really important and stuff that we can learn from. So we're trying to get to that place of where there's a really two-way communication going on. The other mechanism, which is a really exciting one that's kind of coming up through, is the Aquaculture Stewardship Council. So this would be what I would consider quite an important market driver. So when a company decides that they want to achieve ASC, they have to take a series of steps that raise their kind of sustainability levels up to the next stage. This can, if in the right environment, then mean that they get an elevated price for their fish, and this then kind of drives other people within the market to try and keep up with that to make sure that they're not being outcompeted. This is what's called the theory of change, where you get that positive feedback loop of people working towards a better level continuously in order to keep up with the competition. At the moment, Maui Scotland are working towards getting all of their sites in Scotland certified, and we proactively support the ASC system and think it's a really good way of engaging people with what's going on the farms and the kind of areas that are being worked on. It's a standard that is assessed using a third-party system. So the Aquaculture Stewardship Council set the standard, and that focuses on a variety of kind of known potential impact from salmon farming, and also looking at the social elements of salmon farming, which is really important. And then there is a third party, an assessment body, that goes in and assesses against that standard. And that third party is also assessed by somebody else to make sure that they're following the rules. So you end up with this really robust system that means when you go into your supermarket and you pick up an ASC certified product off the shelf, you know that it has been assessed to the highest possible level, and that it's kind of a really rigorous sustainability test for that product. There's also a number of new technologies that are coming through that are really exciting and really positive in terms of what's going on in Scotland. So we've got things like semi-closed containment coming in. So these are kind of semi-impermeable nets. That means that sea lice can't get into the environment, and even can't get in the first place, and escapes are much kind of harder to happen. And the kind of impacts that we don't focus on quite so much, like benthic impacts, are really, really minimized. And there's just beginning we're just at the beginning of a process by which a company is kind of investigating putting one of these in, which is Loch Long Salmon Limited. And that's really exciting. That's really interesting to see how that's going to develop, and what kind of results is that going to show, what kind of work is there going to be. There's also things that can be done to adapt current nets that we have in place. So things like Snorkel Cages, where this is kind of almost like a net that means that there's kind of like a snorkel at the very top, which allows the kind of oxygenated water, but the fish are actually kept for the majority of the time sort of below the water surface level, because sea lice tend to congregate in the upper few meters of the water. So there's still that kind of source of oxygen coming into the water, but they're just kind of kept below the kind of high risk interaction zone for sea lice, and that's hoped that will also have a positive result. In the terms of escapes, we've got things like Seal Pro nets, which are just a much kind of stronger, tougher nets that seals are less likely to be able to kind of bite through and attack. And they're steadily being rolled up. It takes time and it takes money, but that will hopefully limit the amount of seal attacks that we have on farms and limit the amount of fish that are escaping ultimately. And also the treatments that are available for sea lice are improving. So chemical treatments are kind of beginning to be looked at as just a kind of one option in a toolbox, if you like, of ways to remove sea lice. So there's now sort of more physical lice removal systems, such as cleaner fish, which can be lumpfish or wrasse, which kind of live in the pens with the fish and physically kind of eat the parasites, which is what they would do naturally. But also more sort of technology-based things, which would be thermolyses, which actually kind of flush the fish through quite hot water that the sea lice can't tolerate, and they kind of drop off, and things like that. So there's kind of new technology coming through all the time, I guess, and it's just about getting to a point where we found the right conditions in which to farm salmon to ensure that those risks are minimized to the wild salmon. So I'm just going to finish with this quote from Nicholas Sturgeon, which is from a couple of years ago now, but I think it's something that we really agree with and is really important to consider when we're thinking about sort of salmon farming versus the kind of wild salmon. That, actually protecting our environment is key to be making sure that we're able to continue to employ those people and produce that really beneficial economy for Scotland. So I'm going to finish up there, and I'm happy to take any questions, happy to have a bit of a discussion. And if anyone has any questions that they're not kind of comfortable staying on here, then more than happy to take them over email or on Twitter. And those are our organisation details as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Polly, for that lovely presentation. So if anybody has questions now, as Polly just said, feel free to either put them in the chat. There is a hand raise function on Zoom, so feel free to use that as well, and we can call on you to speak. So yeah, first we have Leopold.
Hello. Hi, Polly. Thank you very much for that exciting introduction and talk. You mentioned the different technologies that are kind of used to increase the sustainability in the salmon sector. And I heard about this technology. It's not a technology, but the process of using a different kind of fish feed, not using plant and animal-based fish feed, but fish feed made from insects. And I would like to know if you can tell us something about that.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, just so to be kind of clear, feed doesn't always come into our kind of remit. We tend to focus on the kind of wild fish interactions, and feed tends to kind of fall outside of that little scope a little bit. But I think increasingly there is a kind of focus on trying to move into more sustainable forms of feed. One of the previous issues with aquaculture was that it actually took a lot of wild fish to go into producing farmed salmon, and so there's been a gradual kind of recognition of that and a gradual improvement in terms of taking away that kind of dependency on wild fish stocks, which ultimately kind of aquaculture is supposed to be doing. So I think that the kind of insect feed is just another really novel way of kind of trying to think about different ways in which salmon farmers can operate and can do things. But I haven't got too much kind of information on that, but I think it's certainly an interesting one. And you know, I think that there is a lot of kind of novel and interesting stuff going on within aquaculture to try and understand and improve the kind of way in which it's done.
Thank you, Leopold. Does anybody have any other questions for Polly? We have Maureen with her hand raised. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk, Polly. I was wondering how you would monitor escapes.
Sure. So this is something that actually was kind of the first time last year that we really monitored. So previously, you know, escapes have been gradually decreasing over the last sort of 20, 30 years. You know, the technology of the pens and the nets are getting better, but occasionally things do still happen and things go wrong. And normally when that's the case, you know, we'll be notified, but not necessarily kind of any follow-up action from that. So in the case of the escape from the Carradale farm last year, it was actually kind of peak salmon fishing season, and we weren't really sure what the fish were going to do. You know, it was kind of thought at first that they wouldn't head for fresh water, you know, that they would either stay in the marine environment or die quite quickly. And then within a matter of days, we started to get reports of anglers who were fishing anyway, catching these farm fish, and we decided that there had to be some kind of system to be able to work this out. So I produced a guidance document for anglers, which gave them a kind of identification key on how to tell the difference between a wild fish and a farm fish. There are a few kind of subtle differences. The condition of farm fish these days is very good, which means that sometimes it's not always that easy to tell. But there are kind of a few telltale signs like raggedy fins, and they're often all quite uniform and things like that. So it produced guidance, which was then kind of issued out to all. And I created an online reporting form, which anglers could use from their mobile or from their desktop, whatever they wanted, which just meant that they had to fill in the kind of details of where the fish was caught, the size of it, the kind of any comments about its condition, things like that, and pictures. And that immediately came through to me on a kind of online system. And that meant that gradually I just built up a database of all of the fish that had been caught over that time. And what we asked anglers to do is, as well as submitting pictures and the kind of information around this to us, we also asked them to take scales from the fish, because when you look at farm fish scales under a microscope, they differ to that of a wild scale. So by doing that, we were able to verify kind of how accurate the anglers were in terms of distinguishing between the farm fish and the wild fish. And it also means that we can now kind of present a very accurate report on where those fish had turned up, and how well the anglers were able to identify them. So that was kind of the main way we did it last year. I mean, as I say, it was sort of the first time, and we're keen to kind of learn from that and see how we can improve. But the hope is that gradually there will be less need to monitor them if they don't happen. But we basically just try to work within the options that are available. It's very hard, to be honest, to be able to recapture fish once they have escaped. You know, we don't really know where they will naturally want to go. So it's just about trying to understand where they will turn up, and then looking at kind of monitoring that impact, which is what the genetic monitoring study is for.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Maureen. So we have a series of questions in the chat. So first one is coming from Grace, and she asked, will moving over to aquaculture for a lot of our seafood consumption help wild populations recover? And has there been any examples of this happening, and how long will it take for populations to recover?
So I guess that's an interesting question, because there's kind of a whole load of different scenarios that aquaculture and wild fish kind of fit into each other. So I guess in terms of salmon, there hasn't been kind of a fishery, the stock levels in Scotland for wild salmon have not been sufficient to have a kind of commercial fishery for many years. I did a historical study on the River Spey, which is in the northeast of Scotland, and that kind of had records from like 1700s where hundreds of thousands of fish were being netted a year, and that kind of gives you the idea of just how many fish were in that river and how many fish were being removed, and that has had an impact over time. There's no doubt about that. So in the case of salmon, farming salmon has become the kind of alternative to catching them wild. Now, it has obviously reduced the netting pressure and the kind of wild capture of salmon, but when you start to kind of consider the potential risks, then you get into more kind of tricky territory about whether has aquaculture helped them recover, or you know, how do we separate kind of where the differences are between the other factors that are also impacting wild salmon. A lot of the fish that are being farmed would not necessarily be the ones that we would eat. So for example, things like cod, you know, it has been tried to kind of farm cod, but it's incredibly difficult. So there aren't often kind of direct replacements, and often not widely accepted direct replacements. I think one of the best examples of aquaculture really helping to protect wild stocks is when it comes to shellfish. So things like oysters and mussels, which can be farmed incredibly sustainably and quite sort of efficiently, and they remove the chances of things being using harmful methods for catching those. So for example, oyster dredging, which is quite harmful to the marine seabed if done poorly, whereas farming is kind of less impactful in that way. So I think, you know, the answer, it's a bit of a long-winded saying. I think there's the definite potential to help wild populations recover, but it's very much specific to the kind of area of aquaculture and the wild stock that's in trouble, and then it very much depends on the kind of life cycle of the fishing for the species in question, for how long it will take for that population to recover. So for example, really long-lived species will take much longer to recover than things that turn over very quickly. So definitely something to kind of think about specific case studies, I think, and look at it at a specific level.
Thank you, Grace, for that question. So next we have one from Rebecca, and she asks, how do salmon declines in non-marine farming areas tend to be explained? Is there any consideration about forestry and how runoff into streams following tree harvest impacts salmon egg and pre-smolt survival?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll do the first part first. So in non-marine farming areas, the main kind of explanations tend to be either issues with the freshwater environment. So that can be a lack of good spawning habitat, either because of things like forestry, which may have kind of damaged the more kind of the water quality, and fish can't survive in that, or because dams have been built that meant fish can't get above that. And also now increasingly climate change, which is more kind of a consideration in the marine environment when it comes to feeding kind of changes, but also in rivers, the water temperature within kind of fresh water in the summer is just increasing to go up, and it gets to a point where it becomes a lethal level. And I think in 2 years, 2 years ago, I can't remember the exact percentage, but I think there was a few days where sort of 20% of Scottish rivers were over that kind of threshold for being at a lethal temperature. So there's a whole assortment of kind of reasons why salmon could be declining. You know, previously there's been consideration for being kind of bycatch in wild fisheries. There's no doubt that fishing for wild salmon has had an impact over the years. You know, catch and release in the angling community has really only been widely accepted since sort of the 1990s, I would say. And before that, you know, anglers took great pride in taking multiple salmon home. So there's no doubt that that will have had an impact. But now increasingly, you know, we're at very high levels of catch and release, and we're trying to kind of make sure that that pressure is relieved. And we do need to think about things like forestry and runoff are a big factor. And that's why things like riparian woodland management for kind of on a catchment basis, which a lot of the trusts are doing, is so important to be able to have those kind of tree structures in there to be able to absorb sediment and also slow the flow. You know, increasingly we're getting weather events that mean there's very high levels of water, and these can flush out eggs and fry from their kind of from the in-bed river habitat. So yeah, all of these things are definitely considered. They're all part of the bigger picture, and that's what makes kind of salmon conservation incredibly challenging, because you've got so many things to be thinking about, and you can remove one source of pressure, and that's not the kind of limiting factor, so it hasn't quite worked. But that's also what makes it so interesting, and we know that there are a number of things that we can do to be able to improve the situation in a lot of cases.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. So next we have a question from Saf, and she asks, do Atlantic salmon migrate? And if so, are there any coordination efforts with countries within the migratory route to ensure the best conditions for the survival of wild salmon?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, when Atlantic salmon leave the freshwater environment, they migrate out to sea, and we still don't have a really clear picture of exactly where they go, although we know a lot more now than we did, you know, sort of 10, 20 years ago. But the salmon tend to either migrate up towards Norway and Greenland, up to the kind of almost subarctic waters, or they'll go all the way over to the Atlantic, over to the kind of east coast of Canada and America. So they definitely do migrate, and of course the longer that they are at sea, the higher the chance of them coming into issues. There's obviously a lot more to eat there, which is why they go, but there's also a lot more to eat them, so they're at a higher risk there. And yeah, so coordination with other areas, that's absolutely crucial. So there's something called the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Organization, or NASCO, and that is a kind of governing body for all of the North Atlantic states that are dealing with kind of salmon crises, really, and trying to implement a series of measures to try and limit the decline. So the graph I showed you of the kind of salmon stocks, that's a NASCO graph, trying to understand kind of what's going on and what needs to be done. So they've set out a number of kind of measures and kind of goals that countries within that area should try and achieve. So for example, this is just because it's the one that I know off the top of my head, there's an international, a NASCO goal that Scotland has signed up to, which is that there should be 100% of all fish within farms should be retained within the pens. So that's something that Scotland's signed up to, and you know we should be working towards to achieve. And that helps as well in terms of knowledge sharing. You know, there's a lot to be learned from other areas. For example, Norway kind of has a lot of the similar kind of pressures that are facing Scotland, and kind of similar habitats in which we farm. So we can learn a lot from them, and they can potentially learn a lot from us as well. So there is definitely that opportunity to kind of exchange knowledge.
Awesome. So next we have a question from Luis, and he asks, what are the pros and cons of land-based aquaculture systems versus deep ocean ones?
Okay, good question. So I think the main con of a land-based aquaculture system is the cost. It's incredibly expensive to do. You know, I think there's a lot of people within Scotland that would call, you know, just take all of the pens out of the water and put them onto land. But realistically, that's not a kind of achievable thing, just because of the cost associated with it. And there would also be kind of more you know, visual impacts in terms of kind of where would you put all of these farms, and how would they kind of sit. But obviously you've got a pro that is kind of an enclosed system which won't impact the kind of direct marine environment. You would need to consider really carefully the kind of outputs of water that were coming from a land-based system. But yeah, as a non-fish farmer, I won't go into too much detail on that. But yeah, I think cost would probably be the main main con there. Deep ocean ones, so at the moment there seems to be quite a focus within the industry to try and sort of move away from into sort of more deeper areas with a higher kind of flushing rate, which comes with risks in terms of the kind of current speeds and the potential damaging to nets, but it also means that there is a higher flushing period, which means kind of any output from the farm and sea lice and things are kind of flushed out the system quicker, which is a good thing. But then that does come with risks in terms of the kind of impact on the equipment and making sure that that's all managed quite well. So there's no real kind of easy answer there, I think, but you know, the industry are working to try and understand the best places in which to put their farms, and hopefully, you know, when we start to get a really good idea of where our salmon are migrating in the kind of inshore marine environment, which is a project that's going to be launching this year, we can then start to understand exactly where, you know, the highest risk points are in terms of wild fish interacting with the cages.
Thanks, Louise. So next we have another question from Maureen. So this is a more social question. As you described it, salmon farming is a great job creator, but how can you involve local communities or small scale fisheries and avoid monopolies from large corporations? Yeah,
so again, I guess as a non sort of salmon farming industry member, I don't want to kind of step out of my kind of area. I think the industry has a very clear goal in terms of working to be a good neighbour. So they don't always get that 100% right, but they definitely have the best intentions to be able to work and coordinate with the local communities to kind of make sure that there's a kind of mutual understanding there. It's definitely one of the main reasons that they're kind of they're kind of really accepted within local communities is the fact that they provide a lot of local jobs and really kind of well paid. I think the report from the Scottish Salmon Producers Organisation said that the average salary for within aquaculture in Scotland was £37,000, which is quite a significant salary and an important one, and it prevents the kind of influx of people coming into the city and allows those who want to stay within their local community to do so with excellent career progression opportunities. So I know that a number of companies do things like, you know, they'll offer to fund local kind of initiatives, so building new community centres or sponsoring the local football team, things like that. And then they have a really key, sort of key stakeholder engagement kind of network by which they will, you know, try to work with the local community to understand what their concerns are within about the farming operation and how they can kind of overcome that. But ultimately, there are some areas where the local community is very against salmon farming, and there will always be that kind of divide. But yeah, it's not a hard balance, but yeah, I'll probably stop there before I say anything that is completely inaccurate for anyone within the industry that's on the call.
Thank you, Maureen. So next we have a question from Teresa. Polly, you mentioned the transmission of diseases is a risk factor. How are we regulating or trying to prevent this?
So I think that is a question that I think we're probably not regulating that at the moment, and I think that purely comes down to perhaps not enough understanding. So there isn't really a way to kind of fully monitor for diseases. So we can get kind of anecdotal reports of fish that are caught by anglers, for example. So this is, we don't know the effect, it's not likely to be aquaculture, but we've had a number of fish coming into the rivers in the last couple of years that have had this kind of red skin disease, which is a strange sort of red marking, and we simply don't know what's causing that. Now this is where the Fish Health Inspectorate come in, and they are kind of role in terms of kind of monitoring the health of the fish. So we can send samples to them and they can analyze and try to kind of get a better idea of what's going on and what might be causing it. But in the case of red skin disease, it's continued to be a bit of a mystery. So we can use things like that to be able to kind of work with it. And obviously that's why kind of having a really good communication with the salmon farmers is so important, because if they're having an outbreak of something that could be potentially contagious, it's really good for us to know that, just so that we're aware and we can kind of be looking out for any signs in terms of on the wild fish. But it's definitely something that we need to get more information on and kind of understand better, which will then kind of allow us to hopefully prevent if there are any interactions, but we really don't know at this point.
Thank you, Teresa. So I think Steve might have a question.
So I don't think you've touched on this. So a question around tourism with declining wild salmon populations. Are you seeing a major decline in the tourism industry for people who want to catch wild salmon and not necessarily farm raised salmon?
Yeah, potentially. I think you tend to get this this kind of negative feedback loop when you have continuing bad catches of salmon, that people don't want to pay to go and fish when they're not likely to catch anything, and that means that hotel bookings or restaurant bookings lose out. So there is potentially an impact there on tourism. Fishing is obviously often quite a family kind of orientated thing, so it tends to be the kids and grandparents, whatever. So you can end up with quite a few kind of bookings and things being lost out. But as I tried to highlight earlier, in terms of the economic impact, that's likely to be less than that of losing salmon farming from Scotland's economy. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you, Steve. So I had a quick question. This comes up in almost everything, is the role of Brexit. Have you seen, maybe not now, but do you think there will be a larger impact in the future? Just for example, with like the exporting process of salmon in the UK.
Yeah. So again, it's probably a question better suited for someone within the salmon farming industry, but from what I have heard from speaking to those who are in the industry, and obviously the kind of news releases, is that Brexit, yes, has had quite a significant impact on the exports that they're trying to do, due to kind of paperwork holdups and changes in regulation and all this kind of thing. And I know in the kind of pre-Christmas rush that they're always with Scottish salmon, it was kind of massively held up at borders by Brexit related issues. So I think the hope is that will gradually ease as things kind of get into a better rhythm. But I know that for both aquaculture and for wild capture fisheries, there has been real issues with Brexit and the exports. And I know that there are some wild fisheries that are having to kind of close up shop, basically, because they don't have the markets available to them anymore that were once available, which is really, really hard.
Yeah, thank you, Polly. So does anybody else have any final comments, questions for Polly before we head out? I'll take that as a no. Thank you so much, Polly, for giving this talk, and I'm glad we had plenty of time for Q&A. There was obviously lots of questions, so thank you for answering all of those for us, and thank you for being a part of our Blue New Deal speaker series. Saf put this into the chat, but we do have these every week. So if you're interested, go like us on Facebook, the LSC-SU Marine Society. Our next talk will be at this same time, same day next week. So Wednesday at 4 p.m. we'll be hosting Howard Gunstock, who works for carbon capture, and we'll be chatting a bit about carbon sequestration and kelp farming. So tune in if that is of interest to anybody. But yeah, thank you so much, Polly, and I hope everybody is safe and well wherever they are, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was good to meet you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.